Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents The Controversialist, Arguments with Everyone, Left, Right, and Center, by Martin Peretz, read by Adam Barr. Forward. Vantage Point 2022. The Ballad of My Life. And this is the ballad of my life, that I mumble strange syllables before the people of silence. That's a line from Avram Sutzkever, a Yiddish poet. It captures, better than any other words I know, what it feels like to be 83. I know some syllables that matter, in case anyone wants to listen. You should want to. Not so much because of who I am, though most people would say I'm a psychologically interesting character, but for where I've been, what I've seen. A collection of snapshots are scattered in front of me on the coffee table. Here's me at 13, speaking before a crowd of 10,000 Yiddish Jews on the Lower East Side, dedicating I.L. Peretz Square to my famous relation, a literary hero of this poor but thriving community. Here I am, 10 years older, in a Harvard seminar room, during my second year of teaching, grinning and sticking it in old Harvard's eye. Freud plus Marx equals truth, I tell my students. Here I am in the crowd at the March on Washington in 1963, watching Josephine Baker wonder at the sight of a salt and pepper crowd like one she'd never seen before, saying it gave her hope for America. I see what she sees, or at least I think I do. 5 years later, I am speaking at Harvard Memorial Church to an almost all-white crowd of 1,200 people, some of them my students, about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. But we may take whatever slight hopes we can, I say, from the fact that it was the young who eagerly sought him out. They know, as this beautiful man did, and had tried to tell us, that it is now 5 minutes before midnight, not earlier. 5 minutes before midnight. In this snapshot, dated October 1973, I am in Henry Kissinger's office with a group of Harvard colleagues, urging him to send arms to Israel, quick. Henry ribs me for my dovish politics a decade before. Dovishness, I tell him, stops at the delicatessen door. Here's one from 10 years later. I'm sitting at the editorial table of the New Republic with Mike Kinsley, Leon Wieseltier, Charles Krauthammer, and Rick Hertzberg. We're arguing over a tricky topic, one that's sure to cause grief. This week it is, should we arm the Contras? Last week it was, should gay people have the right to marry? A few years later, here I am at Kramer Books in Washington, D.C., offering Andrew Sullivan, a pugnacious young British conservative, the editorship of the New Republic, and making him the first editor at a major American periodical who is openly gay. Here's a shot at my 60th birthday party under the Brooklyn Bridge, and Yo-Yo Ma is playing the Tennessee Waltz for Al Gore, my friend and former student, who we are all sure is going to be the next president of the United States. And then a last snapshot. It's 11 years later. The invasion of Iraq, which I backed, is a disaster. The financial system that my friends helped build has crashed. My wife and I are divorced. The New Republic is sold after I feared going bust. And here I am in my white suit, walking across Harvard Yard, surrounded by students. Harvard, Harvard, shame on you, honoring a racist fool. The racist fool is, apparently, me. It's a sodden coda, one I don't quite grasp or believe. These snapshots are from the last two eras that shaped American life, the post-war era and the neoliberal one. They were thick eras, and I was in the thick of them. America became a national, consumer, finance-based nation, and a new elite came into consciousness to govern it. I knew many of the players, and at the time, I stood for the assumptions of both of these eras. Some of what we hoped for came to pass. Some turned out not to be. Some turned out to be a fantasy. The subject of this book is how that happened. The question it poses is why. I should say at the outset that I don't have an answer, a broad concept or overarching theory of the past 75 years that can explain all these events. But if I look at them long enough, I can discern the outline of a pattern of shifts. For us, by which I mean the people I came up with, the middle classes of what's now called the silent generation, born between the two great wars, the logic of things was obvious, self-explanatory. We were the only generation to grow up with the old America, a country of ethnicities grounded in local traditional authority, and the new, a country of movers and consumers grounded in distant institutional structures. By us, I also mean American Jews, the first immigrant ethnic group to be allowed inside the old Protestant class. America was changing in the post-war period. Its political, financial, and educational institutions were receptive to new blood in a way they never had been before. My friends and I made a place for ourselves in these institutions. Harvard, the Democratic Party, and then, after I had bought it, the New Republic, which in its time was the most influential political magazine in Washington. We had a hand in shaping them and saw them change up close. The America we came up in was one of neighborhoods and ethnicities and creeds and unions. The America we helped grow, the one we have now, is one of PhDs and interstate systems and investment portfolios. But what I didn't envision was that the institutions we helped construct would become divided between specialists and ideologists, experts and deconstructionists, with very little of the breadth, the passion for applying expertise and ideas to real life and letting real life inform expertise and ideas that characterized the educated leaders we imagined. The equal society I hoped for in the 60s has not materialized. If anything, it has gotten more unequal in the intervening years. Consumption, not cultivation, seems to tie America together. Politics are divided, with the media making those divides into cartoons. Between a multicultural statism that doesn't ring true to the complexity of life on the ground, and an anti-state conservatism that feels misplaced, grafted onto an era that no longer exists. Even the news, which once provided a reliable supply of factual information that could be argued over by reasonable people, is now relayed to the public via attention-grabbing takes on social media and on channels like Fox News and MSNBC, so that the warring parties cannot even refer to a shared reality. My grandchildren's generation, which knows only this sort of shallow, hyperbolic commentary, expresses less trust of institutions than any cohort in recent history. All the assumptions I held at the millennium, at the apex of my influence, when Al Gore seemed to be on the verge of the presidency and the New Republic was still in the center of American political discourse, are upside down. A global America, a stable society at home, compromised politics in Washington, benevolent or half-benevolent institutions, and a manageable debt. The logic I grew up with and operated on was sound, until the point when it wasn't. There are a few things to know about me before I have my say. I offer them not in the spirit of justification or concession, but full disclosure, just so you know that the Martin Peretz who will tell you this story, through whom the events of the last 80 years and 2 eras will get filtered, is such and such a man, with such and such limitations and preoccupations, at least in his own mind. I am a marginalized man. Politically, I'm a Democrat. But even within the party of the historically marginalized, I'm on the side of the margin. Part of the marginalization is psychological. I don't mind feeling attacked. It makes me comfortable. Part of it is political. Everything I have believed always turned out to be somewhat on the margins. People who are held up as paragons have never been my people. Even at the apex of whatever influence I might have had with the Gore campaign, I felt like an outsider. It says something about my self-conception that the modern Jew I've always had the strongest connection to is Kafka, the prototypical marginal man, and a Zionist until his death. My own marginality, or sense of it, is partly hereditary, a matter of my childhood community in the Bronx, a partly Yiddish enclave on the tip of America, which was, to outsiders, a black box. We were foreign and self-referential, confident in our heritage, and fearful for our future. We embraced politics not in the American sense of a pastime, like baseball or the stock market, but in the émigré sense of an absolute commitment. We were emotionally fractured like all communities from someplace else, one eye to our past, one eye toward our people, both eyes on the big American unknown. My character is a convergence of these inherited qualities, and they interlink and reinforce and justify each other. I'm publicly known as a controversialist, someone determined to stir the pot, and who answers to his own emotions and instincts, and to not much else. That reputation for heedless controversy has, to a certain extent, swallowed me, creating a kind of polarity where you either approve of or dismiss me, and is abetted by the fact that I never, ever relent or leave the ring. My own sense of myself is more tentative, more complicated than my reputation. But then, it would be. Still, part of my story is of controversy, throwing myself into the fray, arguing for the sake of clarifying, holding others to account, asserting my grudges and loves with vigor. And my story is of mistakes that come with that, things I didn't think about when I said them, things I didn't say that I should have. The career I staked out for myself says a lot about my sense of my own marginality. I was never an institution man because institutions couldn't hold me or my passions. But I was a supporter of institutions because they were a way in for my people, and, after the 60s, institutions were the only things I trusted. So I fashioned a place for myself as a kind of catch-all on the borders of different establishments, financial, intellectual, journalistic, political, as a connector of their different practitioners with an ear to the street. I've always had a gift for friendship. I love good company and good conversation. And the dinners my wife and I gave in Cambridge were famous. I'm always interested in talking to strangers, to see what I can learn from them. Finally, my heritage, my Jewishness, is another cause of my marginality. But it's something deeper. It's a force in me, not a belief. A force. So strong, so roughly and deeply sensed, that it obviates contradictions with which other people grapple. Jewishness spans 3,000 years, between antiquity with its rigors and abstractions, and modernity with its difficulties and contradictions. To me, there are no divides between the eras. Jewishness bridges them. In that sense, I am not a modern man at all, or I'm modern only to the extent that I see myself as part of a people that modern life gives the chance to mix with others. There's one last thing to bear in mind. People aspire to different things. I aspired, from the beginning of my life, to be in the thick of things, and that aspiration I've achieved. But for all of my success, for all the success of my people and my cohort and some of my causes, I am a dissatisfied man. The society we tried to create in this country, a humanized technocracy, has stalled. The project of my life is incomplete. I don't know why things have gone so wrong in the way of a theory, but having lived at the center of so much history, I do know what happened, what triumphs occurred and what mistakes were made. My observations are those of an insider, but my perspective is that of an outsider. This is a late act in a long life story, an offering up of this tale of failure, in the hopes that it may help point the way to what I and my cohort couldn't achieve, and maybe to gain some late garlands along the way. Chapter 1. Post-War. Inheritance. When I was 3, maybe 4, my mother bought me a canary and named it Fegele, Yiddish for little bird. One day it flew away. I was heartbroken, and so my mother told me it had gone to spy or fight against the Nazis. I vaguely knew I had cousins who were somewhere in a war, and I imagined them fighting together with my canary, which they would certainly feed. I could not quite imagine the war. I wondered how far Europe was, and how far canaries could fly. Fegele is also Yiddish slang for a gay man. It was the first Fegele I fell in love with. But in those years, love did not come first. It was always the war. On September 1st, just a month after I was born, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht rolled over Poland, through the towns and villages where my parents and their friends were born. From my small point of view, the war came through the radio, looming in my mental landscape over my toys and my model railroad, a nifty Lionel set whose tracks covered my bedroom. My mother, Elke, had a little radio on a shelf over the kitchen table. She got upset almost every time news came of the war. My mother had lush hair and fine features. She spoke a French taught to her in the shtetl when it was the language of Europe. She always read Der Tag, the day, the most literate and literary of the Yiddish newspapers. She was, in every way, a product of the old country we could hear being destroyed on the radio. Sometimes when the news was especially bad, she would cry. At night, we listened to the news on my father Julius's radio in the living room, a gigantic, Germanic-looking Stromberg Carlson that seemed built to deliver bad news. My father never cried. He got angry. He was not a soft man, and he didn't sympathize with softness. He was short, he was old, in his mid-40s when I was born, and he was angry all the time. The atmosphere he created in our home was a frightening one. He was cold, and then he'd go hot. It seemed like he wanted the rest of us around just to bully us. But my little brother, Jerry, was 7 years younger, so my father's rage when it came at me, and especially at my mother. When the storm passed, I would go to my room and read, and my father would leave me alone because he respected learning. That was my out. Fighting was a form, the only form, of bonding for my father. When you grow up in an atmosphere of anger and fear and mistrust, it seeps into you in ways you're never really able to trace, but that you're likely to imitate later. Certainly it gave me a thick skin. If I had been sensitive, alive to his complexity, it would have paralyzed me, sucked me in. The news my mother and father heard was not just bad in the abstract. For the Jews of Eastern Europe who were being destroyed were not just our people, but our family. My father had 9 brothers and sisters, and aside from my Uncle Jake, who lived in Brooklyn with his wife and owned a candy store, they and their families were all in Europe. My parents had a list of the people who they were close to, and they were always waiting for them to write. Most of them never did. In the end, my father counted about 45 nephews and nieces dead. On my mother's side, our only survivor was her only brother, who escaped east. The Soviets sent him to Siberia with his wife and daughter, my cousin Chava, who survived and came to America. My father had a special, but natural, obsession with those who'd stayed alive. Every Sunday, or every other Sunday after the war, he went to the Lower East Side where the refugee organizations had their headquarters. the Joint Distribution Committee, the United Service for New Americans, and HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, would post lists of survivors in some displaced persons camp in Europe or on other refugee lists. My father would scan them, looking for people from Levertov, the townlet in Poland where he had met and married my mother before he came to America in the mid-1920s. He'd give money to help those people come to America. Many of these landsmen accepted his invitation and came. Some were nice, some not. Some were crazy from living through the war. Some were almost transparently trying to forget or lay away reminders of their suffering. We had a tiny summer place in Hopewell Junction, upstate in Dutchess County, where some of them came, traumatized by their experience with history. My mother's cousin Heska came with her husband and son to live in an apartment my parents had for them in the Bronx, on Walton Avenue. This boy, exactly my age, had spent the first 4 years of his life hiding from the Nazis behind a barn door. He didn't talk much. In 1950, when we were both 11, he threw himself from the 5th-floor fire escape. Another relative, Charlie, a big, strong, handsome guy, went back to Germany in 1946 or maybe 1947, found out the identities of some ex-Nazi soldiers who had been in a unit that had occupied Levertov, and killed 3 of them. Then he came back to America, where he proudly told everyone what he had done. It was a community in mourning. In the millions of homes transplanted from Europe, they called it the Gerben, the catastrophe. Yizkor books, after a prayer for the dead, were made by survivors and named for entire towns: Warsaw, Vilna, Krakow, Vitebsk, Klesiv, Turek. They were palpable cartographies of the slaughter. Who died and how? Who survived? Who resisted? The books were all we had to remember. Almost every family had one. Levertov said that 3,300 Jews lived there before the war, more than half the townlet's population. By November 1939, 2,500 were deported, and the remaining 800 assigned to forced labor. And by 1945, the community and its inhabitants were essentially wiped out. It was a genocide of people that was also a genocide of culture. My father's cousin was I.L. Peretz, one of the masters of Yiddish literature. Peretz was an intellectual, an arbiter, a convener of culture, and his project was to create a distinctive identity for Yiddish Jews, a national culture like other peoples had. In the Europe of his day, Peretz saw a world of old and new, universal and particular, ethnicities representing their complicated heritages in their schools, clubs, synagogues, and churches, mixing and separating. Peretz thought these cities were models for how modern peoples could be. But Peretz's vision, and the social order that had allowed the Yiddish Jews to thrive, was under siege from 2 sides: the reactionary anti-Semites who unleashed a wave of pogroms after the assassination of the Tsar in 1882, and those dedicated to their overthrow, a cohort of European intellectuals, mostly Jews, who saw states themselves and the rules of private property that undergirded them as the problem. It was a German Jew who rejected his Jewishness, Karl Marx, who called for the overthrow of the propertied class and their states by the new industrial workers. That many property owners were Jews, since that was one of the few activities allowed them by custom and prejudice for hundreds of years, did not trouble Marx. In the hands of Vladimir Lenin, a quarter Jewish from his mother's side, Marx's dream found a state to host it. And within 20 years, the Jews who had helped Lenin set up the state and proselytized it to the world were being killed by their erstwhile comrades. By the time I was born, people like my father could listen and read about both atavistic and leveling hatreds destroying our people from the West and the East, Germany and the Soviet Union. In Germany, we were scapegoats. In the Soviet Union, some of us, many of us, colluded in our own destruction. In both cases, the result for Yiddish was the same. Peretz's civilization became a civilization of refugees, shattered at the point of its greatest density and development. When I was 13, I spoke in Yiddish and in English to a crowd of thousands at the dedication of I.L. Peretz Square, a tiny footprint at the point where Houston Street meets First Avenue on the Lower East Side. In those days, in 1952, there were still Yiddish theaters and newspapers and tens of thousands of people who read, spoke, and wrote in the language. Zionism, Shmaism. There were very few Hebraists. The people who made this new world, our parents and their friends, were solidly middle class through unrelenting effort, and they had all kinds of contradictions and complexes. They wanted to master English, but many didn't want to lose Yiddish. They were proudly Jewish, but almost totally secular. I was bar mitzvahed only because Tante Zlatala, a great-aunt, which was short for a close friend of the family, threatened to die if I wasn't, and my mother was sentimental. The next time my father went to a synagogue was for my brother Jerry's bar mitzvah, and Zlatala was there. They talked politics all the time. They were obsessed because politics had determined the course of their European lives. The organizations they formed reflected their politics above all. The Workmen's Circle, a fraternal organization that promoted Yiddish culture and provided services like educational and insurance programs, was probably the largest of the secular groups. It had tens of thousands of members around the country, which made it a powerful force in the labor movement. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Hatters Union were democratic socialist. The American Labor Party in New York was under the discipline of the communists. They had one Jewish congressman, Leo Isaacson, whose slogan was Peace, Prosperity, and Palestine, meaning Jewish Palestine, and also Vito Marcantonio from Harlem and its environs, who drew his support from a lot of communists and who, if not himself a communist, was as close as it ever came for a congressman. Folk schools were another important instrument of politics. When I was probably 8, my parents put me into Sholem Alechem Folkschule 45, an afternoon school for when I was done with classes at PS 28. Instruction was in Yiddish, and it was carefully pro-Zion in only the most moderate left-wing sense. Zionist organizations came in different political stripes. They all would collect coins in the blue and white boxes, pushkas, to send to the chalutzim, the pioneers in the land that would soon be Israel. $1.50 bought a tree. Many trees would make a forest in the desert. The Jewish National Workers Alliance, the labor Zionist organization, ran a summer camp where only Yiddish was taught, which made no sense, since Hebrew was the language of Zion. But the Yiddish Zionists made them coexist, like a lot of other things in our world that didn't add up. The left and Zionism seemed to add up, at least for a while. In 1947, I remember attending a left-wing rally for Israel at the Polo Grounds, the old Giants baseball stadium across the river in Manhattan. Albert Einstein was the event's big draw, the great Jew of our time, with his saintly politics, as Allen Ginsberg said. With him were Henry Wallace, the former vice president, who thought any conflict with the Soviet Union was a result of us misunderstanding them, along with Vito Marcantonio. This was the last time I remember communist-affiliated Jews coming out for Israel. Once Britain left Palestine, the Zionists lost much of their anti-colonial enthusiasm. Zionism was never complicated for me. It went naturally along with my Yiddishness, however much it reasonably didn't. It was not just because of the Folkschule, but because of my summer camp. Boiberik, named for the shtetl in Fiddler on the Roof, was a summer colony of the Sholem Alechem Folk Institute. Located in Rhinebeck from 1923 until its closing in 1979. The place was beautiful. There were little forests, meadows, a lake. The director was Leibush Lehrer, a real intellectual who believed very strongly that Yiddish was a culture, not simply a language, and there was no reason that the culture and Zionism couldn't coexist. At Boiberik, I met kids from the Middle East and even North Africa. Most of them understood Yiddish, most notably.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?